In this video lecture, we're going to discuss formal reports. We'll talk very briefly about what they are, some conceptual information about them, and we'll also go through how you can go about constructing one. To begin, let's talk about the different types of formal report that exist. There are many different types of them, but three of the most common you'll run into are recommendation reports, feasibility reports, and evaluation reports. Recommendation reports ask, what should the reader do about whatever subject it is that's being investigated? Feasibility reports ask, is the subject that's being investigated possible or practical? Evaluation reports ask, is the thing that you're looking at good or bad? Or did that thing work correctly? In this video about reports, we're going to focus on recommendation reports. It's the assignment that you are doing for the class, and it also is one of the more common types that you will run into. Let's talk about the problem-solving model for recommendation reports. This is a conceptual model that will help you figure out what you need to include and how you need to approach it. First off, you have to identify what it is that you're going to investigate, the problem or opportunity. Then, establish whatever the criteria are for responding to that problem or opportunity. Determine the options that are available. Study the options according to the previously discussed criteria. Draw conclusions about those options based on the criteria, and then invent some recommendations based on the conclusions that you have come up with. This is a little abstract, but that's okay. We'll talk about how it actually works when we start talking about how to construct a formal report. Formal reports have three major sections: front matter, the main body, and back matter. We'll talk about front matter first. You're going to start with a letter of transmittal, move on to a title page, include an executive summary and/or an abstract. You'll include a table of contents and possibly a list of figures. A letter of transmittal is, as the name might suggest, it's a letter that goes along with a report that says, hi, this is a report. Remember us? We're sending it to you because blank. So accordingly, you're going to use the formal letter layout. You're going to forecast the report's contents, and in particular, forecast the conclusion. Remember, a report is not a mystery novel. You don't want to hold back the conclusion to the very end. You want to let people know what it is up front, especially for busy and impatient readers. Use a standard letter structure. The introduction, narration, petition, justification, and action conclusion sequence. So, very briefly saying, introduce us, hi, you hired us, to do this report. We did the report. Here it is. Here's what we found. Please read it. You will find it is a good report because blank, and thank you for your business. Hope you enjoyed reading this. Please send us our check. Thank you. The end. When you write this letter, attach it as a separate document. It goes along with the report, but it is never bound inside the report itself. It's a separate document. The second element in the front matter is the title page. A title page you always want to include 4 items no matter what kind of document you are creating. There's a title of some kind. There's an audience statement. If you don't tell the readers who it's for, no one will read it. You have to specify who wrote it, and you also need to include a date. The date is important because you can think of reports as dairy products. If you have a fresh dairy product, it's really good and useful and it's tasty. But if it's old, you don't need it anymore. Matter of fact, you might want to avoid it. So the same thing applies for reports. Always let your reader know when it was created. 2 things you should avoid in title pages. Including a title page in the TOC, because a table of contents is never going to include the front cover of a book, so you're not going to do the same thing with the report. And similarly, title pages don't get page numbers. Let's talk executive summaries and abstracts. An executive summary you can think of as a one-page wonder. It is a report on a page. You're going to summarize the entire thing on one page. Then again, if it's super long report, formal reports can go up to thousands of pages. So realistically, you can't summarize an entire 1,000-page report on a single page. So in that case, you'd probably have a very long formal report executive summary. But for the sort of thing that you are typically going to write in your careers, you can summarize everything on 1 page, maybe 2 pages. Again, Use these for very long reports. An abstract, on the other hand, is a description of what the report is about. It is not a summary of the report, it is just a description of the report. What is the point of this thing? It'll probably include the conclusion as well, but you're just saying what this thing is about. You would want to use an abstract for very short reports. Whatever you do, though, you always want to include a running header or footer and a page number on the executive summary or the abstract page. As a hint, lowercase Roman numerals, they're often a really good choice for front matter page numbers because everything before the table of contents is table of contents is page 0. Actually, I'll mention that in the next slide. But everything before it usually gets a separate numbering sequence. Everything after it gets a separate numbering sequence. You'd want to use in Microsoft Word the section breaks tool. The table of contents and list of figures section. The table of contents tells the reader where everything is. You've used these before many times in books, I am sure. You're going to list the page and the locations of all major sections, and depending on how you format it, maybe the minor sections. Please note the TOC does not go in itself. The TOC is page 0. It doesn't have a page number, but it does have the same running header and footer as the rest of the document. A list of figures is telling the reader where all the figures are in the document. You can also include the tables in that. It is conceivable, but rare, to put in a list of tables. If you do include a list of tables, make it a separate thing from the list of figures. Oh, and here's a little hint for you. Microsoft Word has a built-in table of contents generator. You don't need to do it by hand. Matter of fact, please don't do it by hand. Just click a couple of buttons, it will do it for you. And make sure you build your documents using the styles, the built-in heading 1, 2, and 3. The TOC generator will pick those up and generate the document table of contents for you. Let's move on to the main body. Main body has an introduction section, a problem and definition and description section, technical background, decision-making criteria, options, comparison, and conclusions and/or final recommendation section. It's very strongly recommended that you start each of these major sections on its own page. Especially if you have a very large formal report, anything that's just a page or two, that doesn't matter a whole lot. Sure, you can jam them together, but once you get into a decent size report, yeah, break them apart. Let's talk the introduction. In the introduction, you're going to justify the report's very existence. Introduce the contents to the readers. What is this purpose of this report? What problem are you addressing and solving? There's a little bit about the background. You'll go into the background more detail later, but for right now, the introduction just reminds the reader what's going on. You're going to discuss the focus of the report. How deep does it go? That's its scope. You're going to give a forecast of the conclusion. You probably are not going to get in huge detail, but you at least want to tell the readers, here's what the conclusion is. So if you're recommending something, here's our recommendation. If you're saying something is feasible or not, say it up front. Again, I said before, a report is not a mystery novel. Forecast the contents and organization so that the reader knows how to attack the report in case they need to find something that's relevant to them. And make sure you remind the reader that they hired you and that you are delivering the report they paid for. Sometimes readers will approach a report like, what is this thing? I don't remember this. Remind them, oh yes, I hired people for this, and they'll be more invested in reading it. The next section is the problem definition and description. It relates to step 1 of the problem-solving model, identifying the problem or opportunity at hand. Your job in this is to view the situation critically, figure out what's going wrong here, and how can it be addressed. So, identify and explain what is the problem, what is the opportunity that the readers are faced with. Why are they reading this report in the first place? So what is the problem, why is it a problem, and why does it need solving? This particular section can vary tremendously in size. For an expert reader who knows exactly what's going on, is familiar with all the details, it can be really short. You just need to show that you have a handle on what's going on yourself. For a naive audience, a secondary or tertiary audience, somebody who is not the primary audience but is going to be reading the report anyway, they need more information about this. So then you need to expand this material, aim it for that type of audience. The next section is a technical background section. It's also an extension of that same step 1 of identifying the problem or opportunity. In this case, think about your report's audiences. As I mentioned before, reports are usually aimed at a particular person or group, but those reports get passed along to multiple audiences. It's not just that one person or group who reads it, but they pass it along to somebody else who then passes it along to somebody else, etc., etc. So accordingly, you need to make sure that you include enough information for those audiences. If there are any concepts that require specialized knowledge or skills that the secondary, tertiary audience, and so on don't know, you need to explain it. This section is optional, so if the only people who are ever going to read this report are experts, you can leave this material out because they know it already. But if that report's going to get passed along, then absolutely you need to include it. I'm not going to take very long on this, but I should direct your attention to the picture on the right-hand side. That thing is a fish ladder. You may be wondering, what is a fish ladder? Well, think of this. If there's a big dam across a river, how do the fish get upstream to spawn? In particular, how do the salmon get upstream to spawn? Because if you block their way, they're going to die and, well, there will be no more salmon. So you have to include a way for salmon to swim around the dam. These methods are called fish ladders. So if you knew what a fish ladder was and you're saying, well, gee, why are you telling this? I knew this already. Well, hey, good for you. But on the other hand, if you're a person who did not know what a fish ladder was, you've just learned something, right? So imagine you were reading a report about the dam and somebody mentioned a fish ladder. In the report, you would have no idea what's going on and you would need this technical background section. The next major section is a decision-making criteria. It relates to step 2 of the problem-solving model of establishing the criteria for responding. Note that criteria are standards. You're going to measure your options against these. You want to make sure that your criteria fit into one of two categories. There is necessary and desirable. Some things must be done in order to pick an option. Options can be good, but they don't necessarily have to. So if we look at the boyfriend criteria on the right, this particular person, what is most important? Number 1, smart. That is necessary. Everything else is probably desirable, but not necessary. So if we talk more about decision-making criteria, what you want to do is describe and define any factor that's going to affect the report's conclusion. The factors that you list here, they must relate to what the audience wants and needs. For example, how much does something cost? How long will it take to do this project? What do other people want? Are there any missing parts that the audience needs to fill in? What is the best, highest, lowest quality? The next major section is options. This particular section relates to the step 3 of the problem-solving model, determining the options. These are potential courses of action. What can the reader realistically go ahead and do? So you want to name and to describe the various potential choices available. What are they? Tell me. I'm the reader. I don't know what's going on. Let me know what choices I have. Is it apples and oranges only? Or can I pick something else? How about bananas? How about pineapples? Kiwis? I don't know. Tell me. What makes them worth considering as well? If you just say, you have apples and you have oranges. Well, that's nice, but why do I have apples and oranges? Why might they be good ideas? Is there anything particular that each option requires? Please note, you are not actually comparing the options in this section. You are only naming them. You are only describing them. Don't start lining them up against each other. Just say, we have apples. Here's something about apples. Here is oranges. We have something about oranges. From that point, we'll move on forward. Please note, if you're writing a feasibility report, you would entirely skip the options section because the options are feasible, not feasible, and to go straight to the comparison section. The comparison section here relates to both steps 4 and 5 of the problem-solving model we've been talking about. You're going to study each option according to the listed criteria and draw conclusions about each option. Here's the thing. I'm going to make this blink because it's important. Any idea that is not in the criteria list doesn't count. So when you are comparing the options, apples to oranges, if you didn't mention something in the criteria list and you think, oh yeah, hey, how about this? I'm going to use this to compare. No, you have to go back and include it in that criteria list. The big idea also here is that this section, your primary and secondary research is going to come into play. You've found out about apples, you found out about oranges. Then this is where the information, you compare it to each other. You're going to organize the comparison by the criteria. One good idea is to use a decision matrix. So, for example, notice we have the options across the top here and the criteria across the left-hand column. Take a look at that. We go across and down. You can use text to describe what about it. You can use symbols. Yes, this is good. No, it's not. You can use color coding even. This is really good. This is not so good. This is terrible. This is fantastic. Whatever it may be. You can also use full-on decision matrices where you weight the various criteria and say this is worth 10 points, this is worth 6 points, this is worth 1 point, whatever it is. You can do this. Point is, you want to draw the conclusions about each option. This is where you, again, I hate to be redundant, but you're going to compare the various elements, the various options to each other based on the criteria and say, okay, this one's going to work, this one's not, this one's better than that one is. Please note that you're going to need to write some paragraphs that explain your comparisons. Don't just put in a graphic and say, here's a graphic that shows. Tell me what's in the graphic. A picture, you've probably heard, is worth 1,000 words. That's a lie. It is worth a couple hundred words, absolutely, but you still need to include the words to describe what's going on in the graphic. And whatever you do, never, ever, ever make a simple list of pros and cons. It is a cop-out, it is useless, and your audience who hired you will hate you and they will want their money back. Then, your conclusions and final recommendations section. It relates to step 6 of the problem-solving model, formulating recommendations based on the conclusions. In this section, you're going to keep it pretty short. No one really wants to read a long conclusion. Get to the point. Provide a conclusion statement that tells the reader what action should they take, which option should they choose, is that particular project feasible, yes or no. You also need to choose an appropriate organization strategy when you do this. You can provide a ranked list. This is the best choice, this is the second best choice, etc. You can put a list of acceptable choices or unacceptable choices. If it really doesn't matter, here, options A, B, and C, they're all good. You could also go compound. For example, what I mean by that is, you can say, well, option A, it's the cheapest, but option B is the most technically advanced. So if you went with option A, this would be good, or if you went with option B, this would be good. And you want to explain your conclusions very briefly. Here's the deal, though. Even if you provide a list of acceptable or unacceptable, a compound, and say, well, you could do this or you could do that, make some kind of recommendation. If you dump the decision on the reader, they're really going to be annoyed because it's your job to make that decision. They are paying you to do the investigation. Make some sort of recommendation for them. Do your job. Then back matter. We have bibliographies, glossaries, indices, appendix or appendices, depending on singular or plural. There are other things that could go in back matter, but these are the most common, and I'll talk about them fairly briefly. A bibliography is a list of cited sources. If you include a picture, for example, a fact, a quotation, pretty much anything you didn't create or discover on your own, you want to cite it in a bibliography. Use whatever citation style that your audience prefers. For technical communication classes, the technical communication discipline as a whole uses APA style. So generally speaking, we use APA. Also, IEEE style. We use that as well. Other disciplines, if you're working in English, you'd use MLA. I could go on, but the point is use whatever citation style your audience prefers. A glossary is essentially a list of words that your audience wouldn't know. Some things that you might include in a glossary are acronyms or initialisms. By the way, an acronym is essentially a word that is made up of initial letters. For example, laser is light amplified by the stimulated emission of radiation, LASER, whereas an initialism is just the letters spelled out by themselves. For example, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Do you say FIBI? No, you say FBI. So we have acronyms and initialisms. If you don't remember the difference between them, don't worry about it. Nobody particularly cares. Also, technical terms that your audience would be unfamiliar with, any foreign words that are necessary but your audience may not understand. Then we have an index. An index is a page reference to a specific topic. An index is going to be required in a very large or complex technical document, but if it's fairly short, then don't bother putting one in. It's just a lot of work. And then we have appendix or appendices. Appendix is singular, appendices are plural. These are where you put information that is useful but didn't fit in the main body. For example, large-scale maps, full texts of surveys, big data tables, samples and examples. Anything that fits is useful, but just you couldn't get it to go in the main body for whatever reason, put it in an appendix. If you include an appendix, refer to it in the main body. If you don't, no one will ever read it. They will never know it's there. Also, you want to label your appendices with letters. For example, the one we have over here in the sample, Appendix C, Sample Purchase Agreement. So give it a letter and then give it a meaningful name. You also are going to continue the page numbering and running header that you have used on the rest of the document. So your introduction started on page 1 and your main body ended on page 514. Well, maybe then page 515 is Appendix A. Include that same running header or footer as well. And that's how it goes. So we've gone through a conceptual rundown of how to write a formal report. We've talked a little bit about the concepts in it, the ideas, how you go about structuring it, and now you are, call it armed with the knowledge, and you can go out and you can do these things. Thanks very much for listening.